Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Code Along. My name is Reese, and I'll be your moderator today. We're going to kick off today's session in about 4 minutes or so. We're just waiting so everyone has a chance to join. In the meanwhile, though, we'd love to hear from you. So let us know where you're joining from using the chat or the comments, depending on what platform you're watching from. And yeah, tell us something that you'd like to get out of today's webinar. We are going to be coding along in Excel today. We recommend, if you have it, getting the desktop version of Excel. But if you don't, a lot of the code along will work in the web version as well. Keep your eye out in the chat for the links I'm going to send through. I'll send links so that you can get the dataset and the file so you can code along with us. As well as that, you can also shortly see me send a link so you can register for today's event so you can get the recording and resources sent to you as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that. I'll be back to repeat these messages for any new joiners shortly, but until then, enjoy the background music. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Code Along. My name is Reese, and I'll be your moderator today. We're going to kick off today's session in about a minute or so. We're just waiting so everyone has a chance to join. In the meanwhile, though, we'd love to hear from you. So let us know where you're joining from using the chat or the comments, depending on what platform you're watching on. And yeah, tell us something that you'd like to get out of today's webinar. If you have any questions at any point throughout the Code Along, then please let us know using the chat or the comments. And yeah, keep your eye out there as well, because I'll be sending the link so that you can code along with us. I'll be sending that very shortly, and we'll also repeat it a couple of times throughout the session, so you can do that. We'll also put a QR code on screen as well. Brilliant. I think that's everything from me. So now I'll hand you over to your host for today's session, Richie. Richie, please take it away.
Hi there, data scamps and data champs. This is Richie. Now, it always amazes me how much of business data analysis is simply crunching numbers to calculate summaries and then visualizing those summaries. So as much fun as deep learning is, even today, you can get an awful long way with descriptive statistics. And the main tools for this in Excel are PivotTables and PivotCharts. So that means what we're covering today is essential for every data analyst who works with spreadsheets. Now, our guest is Aggregated, the product owner for business insights delivery at Telenet, which is a major Belgian telecoms company. And she's got 14 years of experience in data analysis, spanning the banking, telecom, and consulting sectors. And fun fact she told us is that she's one day older than Microsoft Excel. So very topical for today. I did look up when Microsoft Excel was released, and I realized that I'm actually older than the first spreadsheet, which is VisiCalc. So I'm dating myself there as well. So with that, over to you, Agatha. Please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you here in the webinar. So I'm very happy you decided to join. So yes, let's dive right into our topic, which would be the visualization of sales data with pivot charts in Excel. So as Richie already said, perhaps a few words about myself to begin with. You might see two flags over there, and some of you who live in Europe probably recognize them. So I'm Polish by birth. Poland is a country in Central Eastern Europe. However, since 14 years, I live in Belgium, which is another country in Europe, more to the west, where I live and work already for 14 years. Throughout this time, as you can see on the slide, I've covered quite some roles across various companies. My career started at an American investment bank where I was a business analyst. After that time, I switched towards data analysis, where I had my first role at Deloitte here in Belgium. And I must say, this is around the time when I get in touch with DataCamp. And I must say, I started as financial analyst, but got bitten by the data bug very early on. And I was looking for all kinds of resources to study data, to understand it better, to understand how data can be used to the advantage of the business. What are the different tools outside of Excel? And I must say, I've built quite a lot of data background using DataCamp courses. So I would like to encourage everyone doing the same if you would like to bring yourself even closer to all kinds of data roles. Right now, as Richie also mentioned, I'm currently a product owner at Telenet. Telenet is a telecom company in Belgium. It's one of the three major telecom companies over here. We have over 2 million clients, which covers quite a big population of the northern part of the country. So pretty much everybody in Belgium knows our company. What I do there is I lead a team of around 18 data analysts, and we provide business insights, reports, deep dive analysis to our business stakeholders, covering a wide variety of teams across the business, analyzing commercial data, network data, internal corporate data, and so on. Next to Telenet, I, of course, still have the love for education, and that's why I'm very happy to also be author of several courses on DataCamp. You can see them over here. Vast majority of my courses are on Tableau, my favorite data visualization tool. But this specific webinar is related to my latest course, Data Visualization in Excel. So in case you missed it, there's a small commercial break. I would encourage you to have a look at this course. We have 4 chapters in which I cover everything related to data visualization in this most robust and most popular data tool across the world, Excel. We start with, in this specific course, with very basic charts on aggregated data. If you don't know what aggregated data is, we are going to cover this as well. We talk about more complex charts, think about waterfall charts, bullet charts, and so on. The 3rd chapter is about best data practices, where we actually cover the ins and outs of how to use color, which chart to choose for which use case, and what are the main pitfalls to avoid. The last chapter, the chapter number 4, is all about disaggregated data, where pivot charts comes to place. So in case you have done the course, you will recognize quite some things from that, but probably will learn also new stuff in this webinar. So this webinar will cover the disaggregated data. If you would like to focus on more aggregated data charting, follow the course, and the first 3 chapters will surely get you there. What will we be working with? And as Richie has said, there's a accompanying resource being an Excel file, which preferably you would open in the desktop version. You can also work with an online version. The look and feel is similar, and you will be able to do exactly the same. But I'm going to work during this webinar with a desktop version. So if you would like to follow along, I recommend to open it in desktop version. What is our data set about? The data set is a commercial data set, which is basically sales data of a fictitious company in the United States. We're actually very important. What is the level of granularity? We are going to see it in a bit. One record of the data, and you can see the snapshot here on the on the right, actually is one line of what you would purchase. So imagine you go to the shop, you put things on the counter, and in one go, you purchase 5 items. Each of these items is actually mentioned here. So it's actually one order line of specific order is one record. We have various dimensions. What are dimensions? Think about the categories of the data, such as who is the customer, his identification number, his name, where does he come from, the city and state in United States. We know his customer segment. You will see the details in a bit. We know what he purchased, what is the larger product category. We know when the order took place and also when the product was shipped. And last but not least, we also know whether product was shipped via standard class, second class shipping, or via a different method. We do not have many measures here, but they're quite basic, but that will be definitely enough for our webinar. The main measures, so things we can count, sum, average, are sales, how much money we make on gross sales, the profit, so if we deduct the costs, how much profit our company retains, what is the quantity of goods sold, and what was the discount. So looking at this data, we are going to do quite some analysis and nice visualizations in Excel. But before we continue, last slide is just to bring us on to the same understanding of what pivot table and pivot charts are. I would definitely recommend to follow the course I've built. There's also another course on data analysis by colleagues at DataCamp. So if you would like to dive deeper into what Excel can do for you data-wise, definitely follow those courses. But just to make sure that everybody is ready to start with us here today, let's dive into the pivot charts and pivot tables in a crash course here on this slide. What does it mean to pivot? Pivot is an English word. Here you have the dictionary definition of it. It's basically to turn things around. So for example, to pivot around the axis of the mass, if we talk about the sales, to rotate, to turn. It's like turning tables. And fun fact, in some languages, pivot tables are actually called rotating tables. Very strange, but Excel is actually translated into various languages. So sometimes what we call pivot table in English version of Excel is called rotating tables in other local languages. So the pivot tables and actually also pivot charts are the very basic Microsoft Excel functionality. That means that they come with the package. You do not need to install anything on top of that. In the very beginning, it was the case. It was an extra advanced feature. However, since it's so useful, it is a basic Excel functionality at the moment. It is a very quick way to explore disaggregated data as contrasted to aggregated data. We will get to that when we go directly to the spreadsheet, as it allows us to actually perform calculations on the fly. So whatever you would put in your columns or in your rows, the numbers behind it will change. So in this case, looking at this table here on the right, we are looking at the sum of sales split by region and segment. And should we, for example, add yet another dimension in either rows or columns, these numbers will be then split again and calculated on the fly. So basically, as we perform operations on the pivot table, the numbers would follow, which is a great advantage, as sometimes we do not know what do we want to achieve. So it very quickly allows you to recalculate without writing hundreds of formulas and correcting your thinking as we go along. Next to it, I would say pivot tables are also a nice entry ticket to the world of data visualization, as creation of various pivot tables and pivot charts allow you also to start connecting the data together. And you can actually build a tiny data model within Excel, which even can lead you to building of a tiny dashboard, of a small dashboard. I wouldn't recommend using Excel for the purposes of dashboarding. There are other data visualization tools on the market, also free versions. Think about Tableau Public, or for example, Power BI. But Excel does allow you to build dashboards, connect data, and build mini data models. All right, so enough of theory. Let's go directly into our data set. So as I said, we have the dimensions and the measures which you have seen already, and I hope it is visible well enough in the screen that you have in front of you. In case not, let us know. Of course, we would like to encourage you to ask questions as we go along. I'm somewhere within 20-25 minutes, I'm going to make a small pause. So if you would like to ask questions, we can take them then or at the end of the webinar. All right, so now looking directly at our data set, it would be quite useful if we just, for example, narrow down and try to analyze familiarize ourselves with this data set before we start analyzing this. As I explained, every record is something that we are buying, and it can be one order or it can be part of the order. For example, if we look at this record, it has one number, and the row before and the row after already have a different number. That means that this specific order consists of just one item. However, if we look, for example, at that order, this is an order that consists out of 7 items. So basically within that order ID, and we can filter on that, I'm just going to copy the number of the order. If we filter on that order, you will see that it's been placed on the 6th September of 2014. It's been shipped, it's been purchased by this specific customer who lives in Los Angeles in California. We even see the postcode and so on. And then we can see what has been purchased. There's a product name, there's a category and subcategory of products. So for example, office supplies, art, phones, and so on. And also the most granular level when we know even the name of the article. Looking at our measures, we know how much it generated in sales. And those of you who use Excel often, you know that you can just select the cells and look at the bottom of the screen where you can actually see the aggregation, the sum. So the summary of all the data points we are selecting. In sum, that is over $3,700. While if we sum the profit, actually our company goes away with $300 profit from the specific order. There's a quantity and there is discount. So like that, analyzing specific rows or set of rows, like in this case, you can see what this data set is all about. So in case you doubt, I would always recommend before you start analyzing data in pivot tables, always try to understand the data set first. I've been talking a lot about aggregations and disaggregations. So for now, take my word that this is a disaggregated data set. Let me show you how the aggregated data set would look like. For now, we are just going to pretend that we only have 3 states. I'm going to create a new sheet to mock that. I will say states, state, and I will say sales. We will just make some fictive numbers here, which we can, of course, double check later on. But imagine that this is, and I'm going to format it to $1, that this is all that we have made in sales across those different states. This is an aggregated table. It's actually a tiny table that already sums up how much sales we have made per one of these 3 states. Now, if you would like to know how this $1,568 has been made up, what does it consist of, how many orders were, underlying orders were there, we would need to look into disaggregated data. We would need to take all the orders from Kentucky, sum them up. So basically, we would need to do a sum of all the sales. And in this case, of course, it's a much bigger number. We can even just copy this, and the actual sales that we generated in Kentucky is 36,000. We can do the same for California, exactly the same. We would take all the sales. The sum is much larger. We would copy this by clicking here at the aggregation below. Or of course, you can also write a sum formula, and like that, we can have an aggregated number. Let's very quickly do it for completeness, also for Florida, so that you get the picture. I will copy here. So this is actually the sum of sales we've generated across those states. Now, disaggregated data allows us to split this total of Florida for orders. So disaggregated data is basically the lowest level of granularity. And this is where pivot tables and pivot charts start to shine. This specific webinar is mostly about pivot charts, but you cannot live with pivot charts without pivot tables. So let's start by building our first pivot table together. To do that, you have to select the rows and the columns. Typically, if you're interested in analyzing the whole data set, which we mostly do, we would need to select the entire table. There's either a shortcut that you have to just go down and to the right by pressing Control and Shift on the Microsoft PC, or basically you click anywhere within the data set and press Ctrl A. Like that, you select the entire table. And to build your first pivot table, we have to go to the Insert menu and click on Pivot Table from Table or Range. Excel will still ask us where would we like to place this table, and we'll double check whether the range of our table is correct. And indeed, we have around 10,000 rows, and we would like to place it. Let's place it directly next to the calculations which I have just made to double check. I'm going to place my pivot table over here. What it does, it opens the pivot table placeholder, as well as gives you already the possibility to select different fields, which you can then put in columns or rows and columns. Let's try to basically copy this logic and try to build a pivot table to double check whether our sum of sales is correct. So if I'm going to place a state over here, you see all the states of America listed nicely here in the rows. And let's sum up the sales. So if I drop the state to the rows, this is a dimension, this is something categorical. And by dropping the sales to the values, per default, it will select a sum. This is something we can, of course, change by changing the value field settings. By clicking on the small arrow and accessing value field settings, you can change the aggregation type. By summing, you will sum all the values that have this dimension. So all Alabama records, you would sum them up, counting with which count will count the amount of rows that have Alabama as state. Average will take the average sales across all the rows, and so on. Let's say with the sum and double check if indeed our Florida sales are exactly as expected, and they are. Maybe for the visibility, I'm going to also convert it to a dollar. And indeed, if we just filtered on our 3 states, California, Florida, and Kentucky. Oh, I forgot Florida here. We have exactly the same as we have calculated ourselves by summing the individual rows. So the advantage of pivot tables is, of course, that you can sum, count, average things on the fly. And then you have the access directly to all the columns you have in your underlying data. What would happen if I added a segment in columns? As you can see, the numbers which we had, which are now grand total, are now also split per different segments, the customer segments. So that you know that, for example, this big amount of sales generated in California are largely, if I see correctly, coming from the consumer segment. There's a smaller bit coming from home office and a big bit also coming from corporate. Now we are looking at flat numbers, and if you are very attuned to looking at numbers, you see quickly that there is a different trend when it comes to Florida, where actually home office is generating a lot of sales. But if you think about it, it's much easier to spot patterns in data when you can immediately see a chart or a graph. So this is when pivot charts come into play. And while we can visualize any data in Excel into a chart, let's come back to our aggregated table. Probably you know it already. You can just insert a simple chart. You can, for example, use a pivot chart, or you can use a bar chart. I'm probably going to see what Excel recommends. Let's have a look at different options. I'm going to go with a clustered bar. So you can visualize aggregated data like that. We could add data labels. But if I now wanted to add the segment into my aggregated table, as you can see, these are just words and numbers typed into individual cells. I would need to expand this view and do this calculation myself. So basically, every time I decide to add additional dimension to my chart, I need to start typing things again, rebuild the chart, and so on. We can also visualize pivot tables, and this is how to do it with pivot charts. You just click anywhere within the pivot table, and we will insert a chart, actually a pivot chart this time. The thing is that if you already have your data in pivot tables, it will automatically know that you need to create a pivot chart. You can also click anywhere and just insert a pivot chart, And then Excel will still ask you, all right, but what is that underlying data? You can, of course, then go back to your raw data, select it all, and click on OK. Like that, you will start building your brand new pivot table and pivot chart. But typically, I'm going to go a few steps back. Typically, we always start with looking at the data from the pivot table perspective. So if you would like to build a table on top of that, just click on Insert and select any chart. For example, if we select the bar chart, this is what we are getting. It looks almost the same as the previous chart, except that now it is split by segment because our pivot table has this category in columns. So this is how the data looks like. It's not really the most pretty chart, and I'm going to also speak a little bit about data visualization best practices, but we can learn from it quite a lot. What would actually happen if we thought, all right, it's nice to see immediately that Kentucky has quite small sales compared to California. Florida is somewhere in between. But we would like to actually be able to compare customer segments across different states. What would need to do to accomplish that? Let's just try to pivot, basically change what we put in axis and what we put in legend. I'm just going to play with that. And I'm going to change state is now a legend. As you can see, is indicating what is on the color, and segment is now into the axis. So we can now compare, for example, for the home office, Kentucky versus Florida versus California. It's as easy as just dropping different dimensions from rows to columns. So you can do that either in the pivot table, you see segment, state, and whatever you do with the pivot table, your pivot chart follows. So this is very nice. Let's see what would happen if we actually add other categories. So for example, region. Knowing that we have the state in the legend, and maybe I'm going to put it back in the axis, and I'm going to put a segment here on the legend. What would happen if we add region as additional category in columns? You can quickly see that actually our states, the ones that we have selected, so the southern states, Florida and Kentucky, are compared to the western state, California. Now, of course, they are being grouped because this category is existing both in rows and of course in rows in the pivot table, but also directly in the chart. What would happen if we now take out the state is we are comparing a different part of the country together. As you can see, when we have state, I just pressed Ctrl Z to go back, we have a filter on those specific states we have chosen. But if I remove it, I'm going to lose the filter that we have placed on specific states. So let's go back. We can always put the state also to filters. Like that, we know which states we have selected. We can also add quite some more states. And then, like that, our pivot chart is showing us even more data points. So pivot tables and pivot charts are, as you can see, perfectly connected together. Now, let's try to beautify this chart a little bit, because let's face it, it's not the most pretty chart. One thing you will notice that this chart differs a lot from basic charts, like you would have done such a basic chart, for example. With this small notion, I'm going to place it perhaps a little bit to the right. The aggregated chart doesn't have any buttons. However, the pivot chart comes almost per default with those gray buttons. It is meant to also allow you to filter within. You can, for example, select filters on your pivot chart as well. But it also happens in your linked pivot table. So quite honestly, what I typically do is to remove those buttons because they distract me from what is the most important in this visualization. To remove these buttons, we just need to right-click on that, and we will hide all buttons on the chart. This already looks much more interesting, but let's beautify it a little bit. I would like to place the legend on top, so to access that menu, the Format Legend menu, we just need to double-click on the element of visualization that we would like to change. going towards the legend options, we can place it on top. We can make it slightly bigger. That's nice. And I would like to also add the title to the chart. Let's add the chart element. To do that, you can either click on the plus over here, or what is also important, you can go to the chart design. So every time you click on the pivot chart, notice that actually a few more menus are appearing at the top. One is related to the pivot chart options. Basically, this gives us access to different pivot chart fields, but also there's design tab. So if we click on the first option, add chart element, we can also access stuff like chart titles, data labels, some kind of grid lines, legend, and we can adapt quite a lot. However, for me, it takes quite some time to remember where I need to click, so I prefer to use the buttons which are quite close to us. And I'm going to use the button over here, which is just doing the same, and we are going to add the chart title. Now, let's give this title a name. And we can do it very, let's say, boring, or we can do it a little bit more intuitive and interactive. What I would like to bring to the top is the fact that the consumer segment is sort of winning in every region. That means that consumer segment is visibly generating the most sales across. Now, it is not very user-friendly to see that the biggest segment is at the bottom. You would expect it to be on the top. So let's try to change it. How about sorting this table? Let's try to sort by the data by the values. So to do that, we would just click on the column filter, and we will click on more sort option. And then we can do either ascending or descending, either by name, A to Z, but we can also sort by the value. We will sort by the sum of sales in the descending fashion. And here, this is something I would like to bring your attention to, because Excel does exactly the opposite of what human mind would like to see. Basically, is sorting the pivot table in the right order. The first would be the consumer segment, the second one will be corporate segment, and the last one is the home office. However, the chart looks entirely differently. This is a specific situation for the bar chart, and there's a very good explanation to that in my course. So I would like to encourage you to follow that along. However, just for the sake of this webinar, to save time, let's do exactly the same, but by ascending sum of sales. Like that, you can actually see that the highest category, consumer, is now at the top, corporate is second, and home office is the third. The order, of course, of the pivot table is different. Now, I like to use my title to actually highlight the data point. So what I would like to highlight is the fact that consumer segment is so strikingly ahead of other segments. So I would like to use a color that pops to my eye, and I'm going to use, for example, let's say the dark navy blue. Corporate segment, I would place a little bit in a lighter blue, and perhaps home office, maybe that's a little bit too bright because we can't see it that well. And the home office, also some grayish color. Now, this already pops to the eye what is, let's say, the category that brings the most value. We can, of course, also add the data labels or data table below, but I do not like that option because it's bringing a lot of clutter to the chart. But I would like to show you that actually very important, that the chart title has a very important function here. So typically you can either say, for example, sales across regions and segments, or, which is quite boring, or you could just say, for example, bring already the insight towards your audience, and you can say consumer segment wins across all regions. This is already providing you an insight, so you don't need to really study the data to understand what is it all about. We can, of course, enlarge the size of the font over here. I'll make the chart a bit smaller. However, you still need to know, okay, consumer, which color is that? We can always use the text in the chart to highlight the fact we would like to bring to the front. So let's make it a bit bolder. And let's use the same color which we have used in the chart. Like that, when you look at the chart, your eye makes connection between the word over here, consumer, and charts which are in the same color. So the consumer segment is definitely the one that we would like to bring to the front. Now, of course, this only works if you have the consumer segment in your chart. If I'm now going to filter it out, the chart doesn't make all that sense anymore. So I would like to only recommend using this kind of title coloring, color coding when the chart is ready to, for example, present in a PowerPoint deck or to your audience. So this is one of the visualizations. Maybe a small pause in case there are any questions in the audience.
Yeah, we have 2 questions from the audience already. The first one comes from Santiago asking, can you do that selection with Power Query? I am not totally sure what that corresponds to. I think you were selecting bits of the data to use in the pivot table.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, a very good question. And I can quickly show you that this is something I will also show later on in the webinar. But typically, when you create a pivot table, you can just select the table. And I haven't shown you that. You also have a chance to immediately add the table to the data model. What happens then when you add the data to the data model? I'm going to click on OK and add the table in a totally new worksheet. So remember that in that second worksheet is where I ticked the data model. Now, when you do that, actually the data exists also in our data model. So those of you who are familiar with pivot table and Power Pivot and Power Query, you will know that actually that puts the data also to the backend. We can access it via a Power Query. We can edit it. We can add different calculations over there. But I think for the purpose of this webinar, because I would not like to go too much in the detail of the Power Query and Power Pivot, that's probably a topic for another webinar. But the difference is that when you tick that add to data model, you have a few more advantages. For example, when I would drop order ID to values, by default, it's going to be doing the count. I also have an access to a count distinct. And that's the only difference for this specific webinar, because it allows us to the distinct count of orders, which will be a different number if we just dropped the standard count. So as you have seen in the data, some orders have appearing multiple times due to the fact that they have different order lines, so that within one order, a person orders several things, while there are orders also consisting of just one order line. So by counting distinct, we are only counting the unique order IDs. By counting the order, we count every single record. The pitfall of not adding the table to the data model is that actually, if I wanted to do the same over here, I'm going just to copy this table over here. I can remove this chart. Imagine that I would like to remove the sum of sales. I will remove the segment. I will add the orders. It will count, but I do not have the option to actually change the count distinct. So the count distinct option, which is very useful, is only possible if you add the table to your data model, which actually brings the table to a Power Pivot and allows you to do the count distinct. So I think that's the biggest advantage. There are, of course, other advantages. You can add several different tables in your data model and start doing linking references and combine data across, but this is not the topic of this webinar. Is there another question?
There is indeed. That was a great answer, by the way. All right. So, there was just a query about like what version of Excel are you using, and maybe can you just talk a bit about what's the difference between pivot tables and pivot charts across different versions of Excel?
Well, actually, I don't quite know. I think it's the most recent. I think it's. That's a very good question. Perhaps there's a way to answer that. I wouldn't know when exactly to look for that, the options.
You'd think it'd be an about pane somewhere.
Yeah, I think it would be indeed in the. Oh, sorry, I'm
Is it in help?
Oh, about info. Version history. No, that's different.
Oh, is this the Office 365? Does that just mean it's the latest version that continually updates? Oh,
Yeah, I
wait,
believe.
about Excel. If you
Yeah,
click on
indeed,
that, is that going to tell you?
that'd be the one. So it's indeed build 16. So it's Excel for Microsoft 365. So I think all you need to know is that actually for the functionality of pivot tables and pivot charts, that probably wouldn't matter unless you have a very old version of Excel. But when it comes to a pivot, Power Pivot and Power Query, I know that in older versions it is a specific function that you need to enable via add-ons. However, in the newer versions of Excel, you can just get the data using the data tab, and you get into get and transform data options, which actually is a Power Query editor. So now it's integrated into Excel because Excel also realizes that more and more people work with data models. So that's certainly the big difference. However, it's not a purpose to go too much into detail in this webinar. So unless there are any other questions,
Oh, we got a couple more questions. We can do them now, or we can save them to the end if you prefer.
I think if I look at the question, something about the slicer, adding multiple data tables and building a small dashboard, that's exactly what's happening next. So perhaps let's continue with the webinar.
All right.
Very good question from the audience is, can we work with multiple pivot tables? And imagine, for example, that I would like to analyze other aspect of our data. We can either go back to our data source and do it exactly from the beginning, insert the pivot table, or we can just do a shortcut and duplicate this table, put it somewhere here, for example, and just start tweaking it so that we can achieve other insights. I typically would remove all the values, and like that you can see that we already created pivot table number 7. Pivot tables have actually numbers. If you go to if you select the pivot table, you can see that you can give it a name. We can call it, for example, sales region, while our new table will do something else. Once I've decided what it will do, we can give it a name, so that at some point in time, especially if you build data models, you can quickly refer to which tables we are using. But let's try to build another pivot table. For example, we are going to now visualize something with timeline. I'm going to see how many orders we generated across the years. If you, maybe I did a little bit too fast, if you drop the order date into rows, you will quickly see that actually the order date, which looks like that, which is a properly edited, formatted data field, actually Excel immediately tries to group it into years, quarters, months, and so on. It isn't necessarily bad. Let's start like that. I'm going to add, for example, product category to columns, and I'm going to check how much quantity we have sold, dropping the quantity to the columns. Now it's formatted. Now it inherits the formatting from our previous pivot table, but I'm going to remove the symbol and I'm going to remove the decimals because we are here talking, of course, about the quantity to the amount, the volume. So this is typically the amount of orders we generated in specific years. We can click here to drop into quarters, months, and so on. Now, if I would like to visualize this data, I can again add a chart by clicking on Insert. And if you follow the data visualization course and probably work a little bit in data, you will know that continuous dimensions such as time is often very well visualized via a line chart. Now, what happens when we visualize data with properly formatted date? Actually, Excel knows that we want to have the possibility to group it or ungroup it as we go along. So it actually gives us this option of this pluses and minuses. So if I clicked here on the plus, we actually change the time dimension from year to quarter. I'm going to move it a little bit to the right. And if I go back, as you can see, it goes back to year, both pivot table and the chart. So I can expand it onwards, there's of course an option to do that via the pivot chart. If we go into specific fields, you can do collapse and expand, and it does exactly the same. So in this case, these little buttons over here are quite handy, and let's keep it like that. What is important is that often in data visualization we see people doing it a little bit differently. So what would happen if I now try to go back to my pivot chart setting and try to actually swap it around? I'm going to perhaps collapse it 2 years, and I'm going to put all my time dimensions into legends. This looks quite horrible because we are trying to connect discrete categories such as furniture, office supplies, and technology by line charts. Typically, line charts work very well with continuous categories, and there's nothing continuous between furniture, office, and supplies and technology. So please don't make that mistake. Whenever you would like to use line chart, do not connect discrete categories. In such case, actually a bar chart would look better. So let's imagine for the moment that you would like to keep the chart, but you would like to switch it to a bar chart. You don't need to create the chart from scratch. You can actually go to pivot chart options, the design options, and you can quickly change the chart type. This is the function that is available in the basic data visualization in Excel for basic charts, for aggregated charts, but also in pivot charts. So we could click here on the columns, for example, or on my favorite bar charts. Let's this time do something different. Let's do column charts, and we could present data this way. This still is a horrible visualization because time dimension should always be presented on x-axis due to the fact that it's a continuous dimension. But I just wanted to illustrate the point that you can very quickly switch the type of the chart using the change chart type. Let's go a few steps back. Let's go back to our nice quarterly volume chart, how many orders we have. Imagine that we are satisfied with this time dimension. We want to keep it at quarters. Again, I'm going to remove those quite ugly buttons. We are going to probably give it a name. Again, we are going to add a chart title, and we can this time call it order volumes across time. Let's make it a little bit bigger. We can either make it, as I said, descriptive, like we have just done over here, or we can make it very simple, just saying what this chart is all about. So, of course, it's up to you and up to your use case. We have now 2 charts, which slightly explain our data, and of course, we can create as many charts as possible. Now, what is important is that every time you would like to make a pivot chart, I recommend to always make a separate pivot table for it, because every time you change anything in this pivot table, as you have seen, the chart will follow. So if I now decide to here collapse again from quarter to years, this chart will be impacted, but the other not. So what I typically like to do, I would like to have one sheet called pivots and one sheet called charts. Imagine that we would now like to keep the pivots in the backend and like to concentrate our insights about the charts in a fresh sheet. I'm going to select both of them using Shift and press Control X to cut. And I'm going to paste by Control V in the new sheet. And this could be our insights sheet, where we actually put all the charts which we have generated through our exploratory data analysis stage. And now, very interestingly, we would like to start making things dynamic, and we would like to introduce some kind of slicers, which you can see in the course that I built, and combine everything to a little dashboard. How to do that? You can either click on the pivot tables, which we keep on pivot sheet, or on any chart. Let's keep it simple. We will stay with the chart option. I'm going to click on Insert, and you will see that there's an option called Filters, where we have both Slicer option and the Timeline option. When you click on Slicer option, it brings you all the values, all the columns that we have available in the data set. And I'm going to probably introduce a category called, I'm going to select several ones. I'm going to select state. I'm going to select category, subcategory, and perhaps a segment. Clicking on OK, what it does, it generates a selection of filters. And in some cases, things are already selected because they correspond to the pivot table selections. Now, the ones who've been paying attention, you might have noticed that I selected first this chart, and then I went to insert and to the slicer. Why is that important? Because you will see that actually the selection of the state shows me California, Florida, Georgia, and several other states. This is because we have the selection in our pivot. So this represents the selections in this pivot table. So what will happen if I, for example, release this filter? What will happen? It will automatically visualize my chart as I see fit, as I asked in these filters. But wherever I'm clicking, only one chart is reacting to my actions. And why is it so? Because these filters, the slicers here, are connected only to this pivot chart. How to change that? We can click on a slicer and go to the slicer menu, and then you will see the button called Report Connections. When you click on that, you will see that there are two pivot tables in our data model connected together, but the slicer is only connected to one of them, the sales region. So actually only to this pivot table. We need to connect it actually to both tables, and we are going to do that by ticking also the other table. Let's try to do it directly also for others. Well, unfortunately, I thought it's possible, but you have to do it one by one. We are going to make sure that all slicers are connected to both pivot tables. And when you do so, you will now be able to navigate both your charts by clicking on any slicers. So for example, if you would like to focus your analysis on only the furniture category, to focus on that, or maybe even on specific types of furniture, bookcases and chairs, you can perform those selections, and you can also select only specific states you're interested in. With pressing Shift, we can of course select several of them. So as you can see, we almost built a tiny dashboard in a matter of seconds. I wouldn't recommend using Excel as a dashboarding software, but just a small tip, if you would like to make it look a little bit more fancy, there is a way to do that. You can hide grid lines and headings and make it look like a nice proper dashboard with, for example, two charts right next to each other. Let's make them a little bit smaller. Oh, no, that wasn't a good idea. Let's go back. Because making them smaller, I'm going to make it look like that. We could have a filter pane over here so that the user automatically knows where to look for if he or she is interested in filters. We can have our visualizations over here. And of course, you are welcome to build any charts you want. We can build other two charts, and we could add the dashboard title over here. So for example, sales across the years, sales and orders across the years. We can make it really big, and this could work as a tiny dashboard. So of course, there are ways to make it more fancy. It's just a matter of time you would like to invest. Maybe as a last thing that I would like to mention is that actually slicers are not the only filters we have in Excel. There's also another type of filters, which is called timeline. And you can achieve the same by inserting the timeline filter. So by going to Insert menu and to the option Filters, clicking on Timeline. But this is contingent on having a well-formatted date field in your data. So in this case, Excel found that we have two dates, order date and shipment date. Let's click on the order date, and it will generate us a timeline filter. Per default, as you can see, it goes into months, but we can also change that into quarters or into days or into years, etc. Let's stick with the quarters. This filter, as you can well guess, is now only linked to this chart, because what do we have to do? As you remember, we have to connect it via report connections by ticking over here. And now we can, for example, narrow down on our analysis to a specific point in time. As you can see, with pivot charts, we have visualized quite a lot of data. We are for now only exploring it, but you can also create a mini dashboard and link your data and present and analyze it like that. If you want to know more, I would like to encourage you to follow the course. There are a lot of useful exercises, and I'm pretty sure you can get away with way more tips and tricks than we can fit in this webinar. But I would say this is it for now, and let's get back to your questions.
Thank you, Aggregated. That was brilliant. I have to say, it's such a common problem where you have different bits of your spreadsheet out of sync with each other, and then you get these difficult bugs to solve because you're not quite sure what's connected to what. So I love the idea of just separating out your analysis into different sheets. You've got your raw data, your crunching numbers, and then your visualization separately. That's really good. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. There's actually two related questions, one from Saeed, one from Lamna. So Saeed's question is, can you make a pivot table from two different bits of your raw data, so two different tables in raw data?
Absolutely, but then we are getting into direction of data modeling, combining two data sources, which brings us to, in Excel, specifically to Power Pivot. I would like to encourage you to study that. It's actually the subject that brought me to data visualization as such, because once you understand how Power Pivot works, how you can combine different tables together and visualize that in a dashboard, you actually start thinking, well, I need a professional data visualization tool. So just a small story short, imagine that you have this data set and you have another data set that has targets per year per state. In that case, you would need fields that are sort of your keys, your primary keys towards the other table. So imagine it's a state and order date. Let's imagine that we group it per year. Imagine that you have a table with budget or with forecast per state per year, and you would like to bounce your actual results, the ones that we have in this data set, with some kind of targets or a budget data set. You will need to combine the both tables based on the matching keys, the primary keys. You would probably need to make a synthetic key. And like that, you arrive to a data model connected to each other. Once you have a data model connected to each other, your slicers will actually, once you perform selections, will already automatically filter the data from both tables as you click, due to the fact that the tables will be connected together. But that's mandatory to first build a data model, unfortunately out of the scope, but absolutely a very interesting topic. And I would say if you have interest in that kind of topics, I would recommend indeed data camp courses on data modeling, perhaps in Tableau, a very good introduction tool to data modeling there, or Power BI, if that's your favorite data visualization tool.
Absolutely. And it sounds like this comes very close to the idea of creating a join between the two data sets in order to say there's a relationship between them. Okay, brilliant. And there's a related question here. So this comes from Lamna saying, can we connect pivot tables and slices from different data sets? So I think this is the idea of having several different data sets in the connection tool you're using. Maybe you just want to cover that again quickly?
Yes, exactly. So first, what you need to do when you have two data tables, you need to join them based on some key. You make a join, and that becomes no longer 2, 3, or 4 data tables. That becomes one data model. And when you have the data model, you build a slicer or a pivot table, not based on underlying table, but based on the data model together. So like that, you get access to all fields from all underlying tables in one pivot. You will still be able to see from which specific table it comes, but since the tables are connected via a data model, your pivot table will be able to combine the data across. So definitely, I recommend to dive deeper into pivot tables, Power Pivot specifically for Excel, or data visualization, data modeling for data visualization.
All right, nice. And I've got one more question. This comes from Alex. So Alex asks, are you using large language models to automate your templates or the way you've been working? So have you made use of generative AI at all?
Oh, I use it a lot, of course. Obviously, I don't use it for any Excel work, unfortunately. I would say it's useful if you can't hack a formula or get stuck a little bit. But I would say a lot of buzzwords in these questions and great for the interest in data in general. I would not go that far as automating your Excel. I think from the moment when you want to use advanced functionalities like that, I would probably suggest changing tools. I would call it a bit of an overkill to use these functions in Excel. However, there are formulas that can directly make a link to ChatGPT prompts. So it's perhaps useful. I haven't used it actively myself yet.
Okay. Actually, for anyone who's interested in using generative AI in spreadsheets, I had a great interview on the Data Frame podcast with Hjalmar Gislason. So he's the CEO of a company called Grid. So Grid is a new spreadsheets company, and he was talking about how they've incorporated generative AI into their spreadsheet platform in order to increase your productivity. So that's definitely worth checking out. Now, a quick announcement. So next week is ChatGPT week here at DataCamp. So we've got 3 code longs. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It's going to teach you how to make good use of ChatGPT. So please do go to datacamp.com/webinars, join us for those sessions. Agatha's got 4 courses on DataCamp. So I know Reese has been posting links to some of those in the chat. Please do check those out, particularly her Excel course, since I know you're all Excel fans here. All right, so I think we're at time now. Thank you, Agatha. That was really informative. I have to say, I've never used all those kind of slices with pivot charts before, so that was really new to me. That was very exciting. Like, you can do some pretty powerful stuff there. I do like that you can just build a dashboard like really easily within Excel there. All right, so thank you once again. Thank you to Reese for moderating. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. Thank you to everyone who showed up today. I hope to see you all again in future sessions. All right,